Just a few hours ago, on Wednesday, Israel bombed Damascus. And we're not talking about an attack on insurgent positions or anything like that. They attacked Al-Jilani's new regime. The scene, the streets of Damascus once again rocked by explosions, something many thought was a thing of the past. The target, the Syrian army's headquarters. Located, by the way, close to the presidential palace, along with a few other strategic positions.
1 killed, 18 injured as Israel launches new airstrikes on Syrian capital.
So far, there is 1 confirmed death, although other sources, such as war observers with personnel in Syria, claim that up to 15 officials from the Syrian Ministry of Defense and Interior may have been killed. It should be noted that Israel's attacks actually began 3 days ago, when Jerusalem decided to start hitting some Syrian army positions, but the bombing of the capital was unexpected. Even many Israelis have been surprised that Netanyahu has gone this far. This is mainly because, up until now, it was thought that, for better or worse, Al-Jilani was in some way protected by Jerusalem. The new Syrian leader remained completely on the sidelines and even spoke out in favor of Israel during the exchange of attacks with Iran. Not only that, but when Israel invaded parts of the southern border on the Syrian side, the new regime's army did absolutely nothing to confront them. So all this led us to believe that the relationship was more or less good. But suddenly, boom. Netanyahu once again goes and shows who's boss here, and that he's not planning on being tied down to anyone. And many of you will probably be wondering, but what's this all about? Why has Israel bombed the regime that overthrew al-Assad, that criminal who collaborated with the Ayatollah regime? Well, let's just say that there's an official version and a more realistic one. Although, keep in mind, they could both be true. The official line is that the airstrikes aim to protect the Druze population, a moderate ethnic minority settled just across the Syrian border in the south. This is a community that, coincidentally, has recently led several uprisings against the new government in Damascus. And here's the thing, Al-Jilani's people have it in for the Druze for at least 3 different reasons. First and foremost, sectarian issues. The Druze follow an esoteric faith that strict Sunni hardliners in the new government view with deep suspicion. Yes, it stems from Islam, but it's not considered truly Islam. The second reason is political, as this ethnic group considers itself politically autonomous. In fact, in Ceuta, a majority Druze city, often referred to as Little Venezuela, because of its large population of Syrian Venezuelan immigrants, both Assad and today's Islamist groups were rejected. Instead, the locals kept several militias active as a form of control. These groups have refused to submit to the new Syrian government. And finally, the third reason is strategic, because the region they inhabit is key to controlling routes to Damascus and the Golan Heights. Having a population in that location that does not submit to your wishes is obviously not welcome. This is precisely why the Druze have been suffering severe repression in recent days at the hands of Al-Jilani supporters, although it was not the government that triggered the conflict.
At least 248 people have died in Ceuta due to clashes between Druze, Bedouins, and Syrian forces. The number of victims includes summary executions and civilians caught in the crossfire.
There are even videos circulating on social media of crimes similar to those carried out by Hamas in the October 7th attack against Israel. To give you an example, but without going into too much graphic detail, we're talking about Druze allegedly being murdered, and then, after they had died, some individuals ran them over on the ground out of pure sadism. Let's be honest, none of this should really come as a surprise. These kinds of brutal actions only catch the most naive off guard. Back when the al-Assad regime fell, we told you that the rise to power of HTS, the terrorist group to which Al-Jilani belongs, might not be as good news as some in the West were reporting. Now, Netanyahu is standing up as the protector of the Druze in Syria. Hear it from the man himself.
ואנחנו גם מחויבים לשמור על התושבים הדרוזים. אנחנו עושים זאת באמצעות פעולות עצימות. אני מקווה שלא נצטרך לפעול יותר. זה תלוי מאוד במה שמבינים וגם עושים וגם לא עושים בדמשק.
Israel has already warned that if the attacks on the Druze do not stop and the Syrian army does not withdraw from the southern area, the bombings will continue, and they could be even harsher than what you have seen.
Israel threatened to escalate attacks on Syrian government forces unless they withdrew from Ceuta, a southern province dominated by the country's Druze minority.
And guess what happened? Yep. exactly what you're thinking. This new Syrian government isn't exactly suicidal. Hours after the Israeli attack, the Syrian Defense Ministry ordered the withdrawal of its army from As-Suwaida, the Druze majority region we told you about earlier. In fact, videos have been seen of Druze even placing Israeli flags on rooftops to celebrate. And here's the thing, this part is absolutely key. Al-Jilani has chosen to appear weaker in front of his own people, which isn't exactly great for him, rather than risk an open conflict with Israel, the Hebrew state. Alright, so we know what happened, but we still haven't answered a few key questions that I'm sure many of you are wondering about. To begin with, why have the Druze been caught up in a new massacre? Why on earth has Netanyahu decided to protect these people? What is the real situation of the new Syrian government? Well, we're going to tell you all about that and more right now, so let's get started. Well, let's start at the beginning. What is going on with the Druze, and why do they reject the new regime? Well, first of all, you need to know that Syria is a country in political, religious, and ethnic turmoil, and that this turmoil did not end with the departure of Al-Assad. There are several different ethnic groups in Syria, most of them Muslim. One of these groups is the Druze, an ethnic group with beliefs derived from Islam but not strictly Muslim, which is historically settled in areas of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Well, the fact is that Israel maintains good relations with its Druze citizens and considers Syrian Druze to be a relatively favorable ethnic group. In fact, in Israel, Druze and Jews live together in peace and have even forged bonds of mutual protection. Under Bashar al-Assad's regime, Syrian Druze lived in a kind of tense calm. As long as they did not challenge his authority, they were allowed a certain degree of autonomy. The problem came when the new regime of Abu Muhammad al-Jilani appeared on the scene, a regime that calls itself transitional and found Syria torn into pieces. The fact is that Al-Jilani, far from gaining control of the entire country, is having many more problems with minorities than he would like. So the sense of chaos unleashed by the civil war didn't end with Assad's exile. On the contrary, it has continued in the form of countless micro-conflicts between different ethnic communities. One of these erupted last Sunday. The reason? Something as commonplace as robbery with assault.
On July 11th, a Druze merchant was assaulted by members of a Bedouin tribe at a makeshift stall on the road from Damascus to Suwaida, where some 70,000 Druze live. There, they stole his vehicle and belongings and assaulted him with sectarian insults. In the wake of this altercation, Druze militias arrested several Bedouins to recover the stolen property, triggering an armed response from the Bedouins.
When the situation spiraled out of control, Damascus sent in the army to restore order. But this was like trying to put out fire with gasoline. Around 250 people were killed. Power cuts were reported, and entire towns were left without access to medicine or basic necessities. The fact is that truly savage acts have been committed in recent days, from hospital raids to extrajudicial executions and mass kidnappings perpetrated by Syrian government forces in Druze communities. And naturally, the Druze have responded with their own militia groups, unleashing a bloodbath that makes one thing abundantly clear. Al-Jilani's government is far from being in control of the country. Just look at this news item.
The Syrian presidency condemns the violations in Al-Suwaida amid allegations of crimes. The Syrian government strongly condemns these heinous acts and confirms its full commitment to investigating all incidents and punishing all those involved. The statement adds,
as you've just heard, the same Syrian government that sent its security forces against the Druze communities today condemns what took place and says it will investigate the conflict, as if many of their own soldiers hadn't already been at the center of the violence themselves. Now that he has had to put on a suit and tie, Al-Jilani is losing influence due to his inability to keep the whole country under control. In fact, there was a very serious precedent in March with the Alawites, another ethnic group that reported bloody massacres carried out by the security forces.
Hundreds massacred in Syria, casting doubt on new government's ability to rule. More than 1,000 people, mostly Alawite civilians, have been killed by security forces in just a few days.
Just over 3 months ago, Alawite communities in the west of the country suffered the same fate as the Druze. So, sadly, This is nothing new. Ethnic massacres between Syrian groups are becoming increasingly common, almost part of daily life. And of course, that raises some serious questions about the country's future. And this is probably the moment when many of you were wondering, wait a second, Josh, why on earth is this all still happening? Wasn't Assad supposed to be the root of the problem? Didn't he already step down? Well, as we told you, when the previous Syrian regime fell, the civil war in this country was not simply a struggle between al-Assad and the opposition. No, this was a struggle between multiple factions, including regime forces, the Kurds, jihadist groups, a whole array of local militias with their own interests, and of course, the Sunni insurgents. The latter are the ones who managed to take Damascus and form a kind of provisional government. But this does not mean they have control over the country.
In 2017, Sunni insurgents formed a rebel coalition called the Levant Liberation Organization, or HTS, which united at least 5 armed factions. This rebel alliance entered Damascus and ousted Bashar al-Assad, but since then, security in the country has remained in limbo. However, many groups have preferred to remain as paramilitary entities, and although they are loyal to the transitional government, they do not follow all of its directives.
This explains why, when the government says it is sending security forces, it's actually sending a mixture of soldiers, police, and militiamen with no training in security tasks. So yeah, we often talk about radical militants. And that is precisely when everything goes from a law enforcement operation to a veritable massacre like the ones we described a moment ago. And this reminds us of one simple fact: the Syrian civil war isn't over. It has just entered a new, even more chaotic stage. Things may have calmed down on the surface, but the country is still completely shattered. Be that as it may, the Druze have secured a very special international backing, which has turned a local revolt into an international conflict, as demonstrated by Israel's involvement. After all, no one remembers any foreign assistance in March with the Alawites, right? Well, of course not, because there wasn't any. No one lifted a finger. But this time, things have been different. Israel has struck al-Jilani solely because of the Druze. And this is where we come to the second part of the story, and the other big question. Why was it that Israel didn't hesitate to enter the fray? What is the relationship between Netanyahu and al-Jilani? Well, let's find out.
Playing with fire.
Let's be clear. Israel's unexpected intervention, and let's face it, they've been acting more and more like a real superpower lately, does have some cultural and historical backing. But come on, let's not kid ourselves. Don't expect anyone to sell us a fairy tale about this being some pure act of charity. The truth, it's hard to believe that Israel would start bombing the new Syrian government purely out of ethnic solidarity with the Druze. And this is where we come to the other version of Israel's intervention. The more realistic one, the unofficial one. Still, that version of events may very well have played a crucial role in how this whole story unfolded. You see, in theory, Netanyahu would be pursuing several objectives with this move. First, for about a month now, the new Syrian government has made various international advances, particularly with the West. Al-Jilani has not only gained recognition from many European countries, but has now also begun to secure investments from Arab partners. The culmination of this came in May, when, thanks to Saudi Arabia's mediation, Donald Trump and Al-Jilani were able to meet officially, leaving the best of impressions.
There is a new government that will hopefully succeed in stabilizing the country and keeping peace. That's what we want to see in Syria. That's why my administration has already taken the first steps toward restoring normal relations between the United States and Syria for the first time in more than a decade.
This new era of relations between the United States and Syria has already helped lift sanctions and enable financial and institutional mechanisms for the country. However, the so-called Syrian normalization encountered one staunch opponent from the outset: Benjamin Netanyahu. Despite appearances, the Israeli government has been suspicious of al-Jilani's true intentions from the outset, to the point that Israel hasn't established any high-level official contacts or formal diplomatic relations with the new Syrian regime. The reason is that they actually consider the HTS leaders to be nothing more than a jihadist gang dressed up in suits and ties, a gang that will sooner or later return to its most radical cause, because that's its true nature, and it's only a matter of time before it happens. That is why Netanyahu has has not only denied any links with the new authorities in Damascus, but also maintains an open occupation of Syrian territory. As we mentioned, Israel invaded a number of border areas inside Syria in what was supposed to be a temporary measure, but after several months, it seems increasingly permanent. And this is where we discover the unofficial reason for the bombing we have seen against Damascus. Netanyahu warned the new Syrian regime at the time that its forces would not be allowed to operate in the southern zone.
Israel will not allow the new Syrian government's military forces to operate in territory south of Syria's capital Damascus, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned.
The Israelis don't want to see HTS operatives anywhere near their borders, let alone trying to take control of those areas or exert influence over the local minorities, especially the Druze. And on this point, Israel might actually have a valid concern. The two recent massacres, one targeting Alawites and the other targeting Druze, make it clear that the Syrian government is being propped up on the ground by a bunch of criminal gangs. So if you factor in Netanyahu's temperament and the complete lack of security guarantees Al-Jilani can offer Israel, well, it makes sense that this military strike on Damascus happened. Despite the dramatic images, this was a measured strike, one of those meant as a warning shot, but clearly not intended to bring down a regime or trigger an escalation. The attacks we have seen against Syrian military installations and the Ministry of Defense are intended to have a political effect. It's a way of telling Al-Jilani in no uncertain terms that if he continues to do as he pleases, he knows what the future holds for him. And in this case, the Druze and their cultural ties to Israel have been the perfect excuse to prove a point. But what Netanyahu really wanted was to make sure Al-Jilani has no doubt about the power of his neighbor. Then there's also a second consequence, one at the international level. Because with this move, Israel is sending a clear message to the West. As far as they're concerned, all this talk about normalization is still nothing but a sham. And there's even a third possible reading, one that's more internal. It could be that Bibi was aiming for a dramatic show of force, right at a time when things like this are happening.
A key coalition partner of Netanyahu is quitting, leaving him with a minority in the Israeli parliament. Leading a minority government would make governing a challenge for Netanyahu.
In recent weeks, Netanyahu's insistence on extending military service to Orthodox Jewish sectors has cost him the departure of several coalition partners. For now, some parties have decided to leave the cabinet, but not to withdraw their support in the event of a no-confidence vote. However, the government will now once again be in a minority. So, the attacks ordered against Syria and the involvement in the Druze-Syrian conflict could even serve to justify internally that they have so many threats that they need to expand recruitment. Rebuilding and uniting a nation after more than a decade of civil war and trying to bring about some kind of stability is no easy task. We'll see what happens. For now, what's clear is that things aren't nearly as sweet and rosy as some media outlets would have us believe. But while all that unfolds, one thing's for sure, now it's your turn. What do you think will happen to the Druze in Syria? Do you think Israel will manage to convince Al-Jilani to give them free reign in the south of the country as they are demanding? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a new confrontation between Jerusalem and Damascus? Well, leave your opinions below in the comments, and let's get the debate going. And very importantly, if you like this video, please click the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. As always, thank you so very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.